In this section, we'll look at the two most famous areas of Kennedy's foreign policy, Germany and Cuba. Kennedy, I should note at the outset, had his first face-to-face meeting with Khrushchev in June 1961 in Vienna, Austria. Khrushchev assumed Kennedy was a lightweight, a pretty boy, and was especially mean and bellicose. Khrushchev demanded that Kennedy recognize East Germany, which the West still hadn't done. If the Americans recognized East Germany formally, Khrushchev calculated, it would mean that all legal agreements on the division of Germany were no longer in effect, thereby undercutting the West's continued control of West Berlin, which is in the middle of East Germany. Khrushchev threatened Kennedy by saying that he wanted the Berlin issue settled by the end of the year, or he would conclude a separate Soviet-East German treaty, and that would, of course, leave the U.S. to deal directly with a country it didn't even recognize. Berlin was an urgent issue for Khrushchev and the East Germans because thousands of East Germans were fleeing each month into West Berlin. The Berlin situation grew steadily worse when East Germany, determined to end the flood of refugees to West Berlin, closed the boundary between eastern and western sections of the city in August, and then Soviet troops surrounded the city. The Western Allies protested, but they couldn't do much to stop the East Germans and the Soviets from beginning to build a wall of concrete blocks and barbed wire, the so-called Berlin Wall, from running completely around the city. To reassure anxious West Berliners, Kennedy sent Vice President Johnson on a visit to the city to renew American pledges of support, and he appointed General Lucius Clay, who was a symbol of American firmness during the Berlin blockade about 13 years before, as his personal representative there. And then, probably in the most dramatic move, he reinforced the American garrison only miles away from the 100-mile Autobahn from West Germany to Berlin. The pressure seemed to work. Khrushchev announced that he would no longer insist upon a settlement of Berlin before the end of the year, but the Berlin Wall stood. A little more than a year and a half later, Kennedy himself went to West Berlin and gave a speech attended by thousands of Berliners. He famously concluded it with the German phrase, Ich bin ein Berliner, I am a Berliner. The crowd loved it, and it's become one of Kennedy's most famous speeches. Today there's a statue of Kennedy in Berlin. One of the low points of the Kennedy presidency was his famous Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. As Kennedy came in to power, the CIA operation for using Cuban exiles, training them and sending them back into Cuba to topple Castro was well underway, and they were training in the mountains of Guatemala. Kennedy approved the plan, which proved was a really bad decision. As a matter of fact, a lot of people were against it, including several White House advisors and Senator William Fulbright, who was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. The critics complained that leading the rebel force would be former supporters of Batista rather than the anti-Batista exiles from Castro's Cuba. That meant that when they returned to Cuba, it would make an uprising among the Cuban people less likely because no one really liked Batista. Also, reports were starting to trickle out that the United States was training anti-Castro people in Central America, and the Cubans knew that an invasion was coming. As a matter of fact, in the year 2000, the Washington Post, looking at former Soviet records, understood that the Soviets even knew the day that an invasion was taking place. So the invasion was probably doomed from the start. The Cuban airfields were attacked on the morning of April 15, 1961 by B-26 fighter bombers, which the U.S. claimed were flown by defecting Cuban Air Force pilots, but were later revealed to have taken off from a base in Central America. The actual landing took place before the dawn on April 17th in the Bay of Pigs on the southern coast of Cuba. An estimated 1,500 Cuban refugees took part in the landing. In the absence of air and naval artillery cover, however, the invaders were pinned down and overwhelmed within a couple of days by Castro's forces. Contact with the underground wasn't made, and the much-anticipated anti-Castro uprising didn't occur. At home, the defeat really didn't dent Kennedy's popularity, which actually soared to 83%. Most people, at least in the United States, approved of the effort, at least. But in the international community, it was a real black eye for America. Khrushchev combined threats of possible Soviet intervention in defense of Cuba with pious lectures to Kennedy on good conduct and the importance of observing international law. A number of Latin American governments reacted negatively because they had a history of interventionism with the U.S. intervening. So it was a real public relations debacle. And what it really did was strengthen Castro's control of Cuba. It had the exact opposite effect of what it hoped to happen. If Cuba provided the sort of low point of Kennedy's foreign policy with the Bay of Pigs, Cuba also, about a year and a half later, provided one of the bright spots for Kennedy's policies, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Large numbers of Soviet technicians and soldiers began to arrive in Cuba in the summer of 1962. The Soviets told the Americans that the personnel were there defensively, obviously a reaction to the Bay of Pigs invasion. But only days after the Soviets told them that, U-2 spy planes depicted that the Soviets were putting in medium-range ballistic missiles that were capable of carrying nuclear warheads in Cuba, which was only 90 miles off of the coast of Cuba. And while ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and submarine-based missiles were still capable of attacking America anyway, Kennedy had to have a strong response because of he still had a lot of egg on his face from the Bay of Pigs, and the Republicans were pressuring him, and the congressional elections were only a few weeks away, and so Kennedy had a real crisis on his hand. In his ExComm, his executive committee of advisors, there's real disagreement on what to do. Some of them, such as General Maxwell Taylor and former Secretary of State Dean Acheson, said, the Soviets hadn't armed any sort of nuclear missiles on these missile sites, and so what they should do, the United States should preemptively bomb them and prevent them from bringing in nuclear weapons to those missile sites. But Kennedy agreed with his brother Robert Kennedy, who was Attorney General, and Secretary McNamara, that would could spark World War III, and he didn't want to be the first one to fire the shot that started it. And what they decided to do was blockade the Cuba, and if the Soviets fought their way in, then we'd have World War III, but the Americans wouldn't have caused it. Kennedy announced his plan in a nationally televised address on October 22nd, 1962, and demanded that prompt dismantling and withdrawal of all offensive bases, and he also declared an emergency meeting of the Security Council and pressed it to maintain a quarantine. Actually, it was like a selective blockade until all the bases and missile sites had been removed. It was a very scary moment. It was one of the most direct and ominous confrontations in the history of Soviet-American relations. It seemed like the world's on the brink of nuclear war. When Soviet troops arrived at the blockade, everything seemed about ready to explode into war. But after a couple of days, Khrushchev sort of blinked. He first asked for the evacuation of obsolete American bases in Turkey in exchange for removing the missile sites in Cuba. The bases in Turkey had missiles that America was going to move anyway. The Turkish government wanted them out, but Kennedy refused. He's going to play it tough. And with nowhere to go, Khrushchev finally agreed to remove the nuclear missile sites, and in exchange for an American pledge not to invade Cuba. Now, of course, the United States had no plans to invade Cuba after the Bay of Pigs, so it was no skin off them. And everybody recognized that it was an American victory, and Kennedy got a lot of credit, in the international community, but Khrushchev was kind of publicly embarrassed. The Cuban Missile Crisis kind of freaked everybody out. And what you see is renewed efforts for détente, both the Americans and the Soviets. The result was negotiations in the summer of 1963 1963 on a nuclear test ban treaty, and the result in the fall was a treaty to ban atmospheric and water testing of nuclear weapons, anything that might spread radioactivity beyond the border of the testing country. It still allowed nuclear testing underground, but it was still important because it showed that both the United States and the Soviet Union were still willing to work together, and it showed that maybe we're seeing tensions cooling after this this close call of the Cuban Missile Crisis. This concludes the section on Kennedy's foreign policy regarding Germany and Cuba.